from strange drawings to Hollywood movies, and even state-of-the-art theme park attractions. A burning Wicker Man is ingrained into our collective consciousness. But what is the truth of this strange, frightening image? Were Wicker Men truly burnt by our ancestors? And are they evidence of human sacrifice? In this documentary, I will attempt to trace the history of this elusive piece of folklore, from its obscure beginnings to its continuing popularity. The Wicker Man is everywhere in popular culture today, and so I thought I'd start here in the modern day with a ride on the Wicker Man at Alton Towers, the first new wooden rollercoaster to be built in the UK for over 20 years. This Wicker Man is called Big Bob, and you might think that this has nothing to do with the true history of such figures. And you'd be mostly right, but there is one interesting thing about this ride, of which I'll return to later. For now, it's time to have a ride on this before we go back into the depths of prehistory.
Welcome, chosen few. We are the Bjorn. For hundreds of years, our family has lived in these woods, led by the spirit of the Wicker Man. What an honor to see yourself bound in wicker, encased in his soul. You see yourself in him. The time has come for the Wicker Man to rise. Together, we shall lead the flame. Let the ceremony commence.
The history of such large wicker effigies is shrouded in mystery, and in fact almost all evidence of their existence comes from two sources: the writings of Julius Caesar and the Greek philosopher Strabo. In his 1st century work, Commentary on the Gallic War, Caesar records his accounts of Celtic and Germanic peoples of Gaul, of whom opposed Roman rule. In volume 6 of this work, he records that the druids had figures of vast size, the limbs of which formed of osiers they fill with living men, which, being set on fire, the men perish, enveloped in the flames. He goes on to state that the sacrifice of a criminal was the most pleasing to these bloodthirsty gods, but that innocents could be burned if the supply of criminals grew thin. Writing later, Strabo records something similar. Having devised a colossus of straw and wood, he says, they throw into the colossus cattle, wild animals, and all sorts of human beings, and then make a burnt offering of the whole thing. Are these accounts reliable? It's worth noting that Caesar did not actually see these events firsthand. Rather, he was echoing earlier writings of Posidonius, of whom visited Gaul 50 years earlier, and wrote of encountering human sacrifice. But Posidonius was a Roman sympathizer, and some believe that he may have been influenced by rumours, exaggerations, and even fabrications in his accounts. Furthermore, Caesar's language exposes his bias. When discussing the alleged sacrifice of non-criminals, he writes that they can even go so low as to inflict punishment on the innocent. This loaded language of going low suggests that he was writing with the purpose of portraying those opposing Roman rule as somehow lower, more barbarian, lesser than those of the empire. That said, there is at least some evidence of human sacrifice with our Iron Age ancestors in Europe, the most potent of these being bog bodies, mummified remains unearthed from peat bogs, their skin stained by the chemical composition of the peat, of which also preserved their skin and hair in sometimes remarkable ways. These bodies were known after the bogs they were found in. Lindow Man from Lindow in Cheshire, for example, or Grawball Man and the famous Tolland Man from Jutland. Examination of these curious mummies shows some evidence of a violent death and even sacrifice. In the case of Tolland Man, a noose is still visibly tied around his neck, and with Lindow Man, the remains of an ancient flatbread, a bannock, was found mixed with mistletoe pollen in his stomach, and his body was brutalised in a way sometimes described as overkill, that is to say, excessive force far greater than what would be needed to simply kill him. Were these bodies killed and sacrificed to gods or spirits? Some believe this may be so, and since Lindow Man seems to have suffered from 3 fatal injuries, strangulation, a cut throat, and a hit to the head, some suggest that this may have been a 3-fold death, a mimicking of the deaths of gods and heroes in the ancient folk tales. Whatever the truth, these bog bodies were not placed inside a wicker effigy and burnt, but rather laid out carefully in the peat bogs. They also died before the Roman era, telling us once again that the accounts of Caesar or Posidonius are at best second-hand, based on folk memory and oral tradition. So, is there any evidence of wicker structures like those we read about with Caesar being actually constructed by our ancestors? At first glance, it seems unlikely that wicker men like those we see in the movies could actually work in the way they are depicted, as the structure of the effigy would quickly fall apart when it was engulfed by flame, allowing the person or animal inside to escape. However, that does not mean that there is no evidence of human-shaped effigies like this being constructed. Another source, Florus, writes of human sacrifice practiced by the Balkan Celts, and when we trace the history of this with the aim of discovering wicker effigies, an interesting parallel begins to appear. The drowning of Marzana is a spring equinox ritual thought to date back to prehistory in the region, possibly as far back as the arrival of grain and livestock farming from the Fertile Crescent by way of Anatolia. This ritual, of which is still practiced today in some regions, is concerned with the construction of a woven straw effigy of Marzana, a personification of an ancient Slavic goddess of winter and death. This winter witch was carried through a village by children, of whom would take great joy in abusing and torturing the idol, before it was set aflame on the banks of a river. As the flames rose and the idol was engulfed, it would be thrown into the river to quench the flames. Later, the burnt idol was retrieved from the waters and was now known as the corpse of Marzana, and it was carried back through the village by young girls, of whom would dance, sing, and collect donations as they paraded through the streets. This ritual is a symbolic representation of death and rebirth. The winter witch is destroyed by the coming of the sun, of summer, and she is killed in what could amount to another example of overkill like we saw with the Lindow Man. This doll is tortured, burnt, and finally drowned, thus resulting in the promise of summer and of a good harvest to come. So was there anything like the drowning of Marzana happening in Western Europe at the time of this ritual? I set out to a number of museums to look for wicker or straw effigies, and discovered a theme of which was far more subtle than Marzana's gruesome death, but still held some of the same ideas. Indeed, every folk museum I visited contained a selection of corn dollies, forming a rich part of harvest custom before the start of mechanisation. These little dolls were woven from corn, and they are personifications of the spirit of the crop, fashioned from the last sheaths of wheat after harvest. In some traditions, these dolls were known as corn mothers or the old woman, and were brought home following the harvest, dressed up in women's clothes and bathed in water. Sometimes the effigy would be created by the oldest married woman in the village, and she would form a wreath from part of the doll, decorate it with flowers, and give it to the prettiest young girl of the village to wear. The corn doll would sometimes be placed on top of a pile of wood and become the central point of the harvest supper and dance, before being brought home and spending all winter in the farmhouse. Then, upon the day of the first furrow of the new season, she would be ploughed back into the field, this way impregnating the earth with her spirit, of the good memories of the harvest of last year, and of the promise of more to come. In this museum, the small corn dolly was placed in its traditional winter home, over the mantelpiece of the hearth, or home fire. It seemed obvious when I examined my own old fireplace that this would be the most common scene of fire in the lives of our ancestors, giving not only heat and light, but a gathering place for the family. With the doll placed above the fire, it too would glint and shimmer in the dance of the flames, sharing in the lives of the people of the farmhouse. With the corn dolly and the idol of Marzana being symbolically sacrificed as a harvest ritual, could this be an explanation of something of the origins of the later accounts, warped through bias and mistranslation into the idea of a Wicker Man? It certainly seemed more likely than the idea that such idols were truly constructed, of which their current form was inspired by an 18th century engraving in Thomas Pennant's A Tour in Wales. If this is so, however, how would the violent deaths of the bog bodies and other alleged sacrificial victims link in, whether mistranslated or not, into these very potent and fertile harvest rituals? Some of the earliest types of deities were simple ideas of a sky father and an earth mother, of which, despite their cultural and historic forms making them different in their stories and creation myths, are really rather easily understood. Just as we are born from our mother and father coming together in an act of sexual unity, so life on earth is born and sustained by a father in the sky and a fertile Mother Earth of the land. Bodies of water, where the reflection of the sky made it seem as though the father and the mother had come together, were common places of spiritual power and ritual. A fact seen in that so many historic churches were built over the sites of existing places of worship, and can be found next to natural springs and flowing water. In fact, this is one thing I found rather interesting about the Wicker Man roller coaster. It too was built over the site of an earlier body of water. The old log flume ride, of which closed in 2015, was thus replaced by the Wicker Man, replacing the earlier body of water with a new idol upon its site. Water was also seen as being concerned with female fertility, the seas controlled by the moon, and the waters of life evident to all during times of childbirth. as well as a passage to the underworld realms of the gods themselves. The alternative to this, the symbol of male fertility, may thus be found elsewhere. Here we return to Caesar and Strabo, of whom wrote of the strange rituals of the druids, or the priests of Celtic paganism. Some believe that the druids regarded the white berries of mistletoe as powerfully fertile, their seeds resembling that of semen, and indeed the plant was known in ancient Greece as oak sperm. Pliny the Elder recorded the use of mistletoe by druids in his work Natural History, wherein he suggested that mistletoe was cut down by a druid during a sacred rite before 2 white bulls were sacrificed, and an elixir was made to cure all ailments. Just like Caesar's writings, we can treat this report with some skepticism, and yet we are reminded that the Lindo man, one of the allegedly sacrificed bog bodies, had consumed mistletoe before his violent death. Was the mistletoe medicinal, a type of painkiller, or was it long part of a sacrificial ritual, the white bulls element added later, just as we saw with the construction of churches over the sites of earlier deities, or even the later association of mistletoe with kissing at Christmas? We may never know, and it seemed as though it would be impossible to find further evidence linking these practices to the burning of wooden idols. That was, until I found in an old folklore book the account of a long-forgotten practice known as burning the bush. Here, our ancestors would form a sphere or ball from hawthorn and mistletoe at its centre, so as to form a crude representation of the sun. Just like with the corn dollies, it was placed over the hearth throughout the winter, before being burnt on the first day of the year, and a new bush was made and brought back into the farmhouse to begin this ritual anew. I was able to attend a recreation of the bush burning ceremony, and it seemed quite obvious that this, just like all of the other rituals we have explored during this documentary, was part of a rich culture of harvest and seasonal worship. The mistletoe inside this sphere being the seed of life, the potential for birth, just as with the seminal fluid it was said to represent. Hereby this sacred sperm sacrificed in flame as the sun returns to earth. This was in many ways the closest thing to the burning of a wicker man with an actual life inside it, the mistletoe being this fertile sexual force and part of the dualism of God and Goddess. I returned home to light a candle at the hearth, and to reflect upon the many centuries of lost beliefs and practices, of whom so easily disappear into a land of the lost, of the misunderstood. The burning bush, and its many other forms, are stories of a deep, almost symbiotic connection with nature and the seasons, and far from some evil sacrifice to a bloodthirsty god, they in fact represent a world and a way of being, of which is very much in tune with life, death, rebirth, the going down of the sun, and the rising in the morning to toil on the fields, to live amongst our animals and our plants, respectful and at one with the world of where we come from, and where one day we will return. This is a way of life of which, for many of us, will only ever be experienced in stories and fiction of where the Wicker Man is burnt.